Welcome, everyone. This is Rob Waters, Vice President and Program Director with State HIT Connect. We're very excited to host today's Industry Insights webinar entitled The Missing Module, Data Processing as a Workstream for Medicaid Modernization. MarkLogic is our Platinum community sponsor who are partnering with us for today's session. On a very timely topic as states embark on data infrastructure modernization programs, a lot of activity in this space at the moment. I do want to just let you know, if you want to learn a little bit more about MarkLogic, we've put in a link to their resource page at the State HIT Connect community website, which you can access and see videos and white papers, etc. That they've uploaded to that resource as well. So, without any further sort of delay, I know the team, have certainly put a lot of work into planning out some key learning objectives here, and this will be pretty interactive then towards the end as part of the Q&A. So I'll introduce the presenters. Gary Katz, Senior Account Executive with MarkLogic for SLED will be kicking things off, and then following him, Kevin Morgan, Vice President Solutions Engineering, again with MarkLogic, will be running the demo and also participating in the Q&A. So certainly a lot of opportunity for learning and interaction here. I'll pass this over to Gary. Welcome, Gary.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rob, for having us here today. Hi, folks. My name is Gary Katz. I'm Senior Account Executive with MarkLogic. This is my second time at MarkLogic. I've been with the company roughly about 12 years, not counting the time, counting the time away, I should say. And I've spent most of my career working overwhelmingly in data and linguistics, master data management capabilities in both national security and defense sectors, as well as most recently over the past 4 or 5 years in health and human services. I'm joined today by Kevin Morgan, who runs our solutions engineering team and is responsible for overseeing the work and investments that we put into what we call our Medicaid Accelerator program that has put out capabilities that are geared very specifically towards the Medicaid industry itself and the healthcare industry more broadly. We're here to talk today about data processing as a work stream. Agendas kill suspense, and yet nonetheless, I like to let people know where we're going. We're going to talk briefly about why data processing should be considered a work stream, and then immediately talk about how an operational data store combined with a data catalog can actually help both exemplify why it should be a work stream, but how it also simplifies those data tasks that are associated with why it should be considered its own work stream. We'll then quickly just recap, bring it back up, and open up to Q&A. So in a nutshell, we've worked on, let me jump through here. We've worked on lots of different kinds of projects, and in particular with our Medicaid projects, what we see are lots of different modules that are put out, from systems integration modules, W modules, to pharmacy modules, to trying to understand, one, how do you set the foundation of your Medicaid enterprise, and how do you make that accessible to the subsequent modules? And the root of this is that, yes, usually the systems integration module tends to sit sort of at the foundational layer, but there's a lot of actual work that doesn't involve the data that gets done there, to say nothing of the data activities that tend to consume that module. So when we talk about data, we try to look at it not just from, hey, we should talk about data as its own thing for the sake of its own thing, but because we see the complexity that it can add if it's done using what I call legacy means of it, in order to use systems approaches in order to attack data problems. So by way of example, simple ETL is too simple. Colloquially, sometimes I like to call simple ETL ETL. At the end of the day, you're trying to pull lots of different data sources together into one coherent message, if you will. And a lot of times you get lost inside of lots of complex operations that are done inside from lots of different data sources. And you need to see, hey, how did this particular operation change? And there's very good livings made off of ETL development and folks who understand those workflows and being able to, tweak them. But in order to do it, you need a surgeon's touch, because if you make one change to one of those ETL flows, there's a lot of downstream processing that can be affected by it. So, second, metadata is data. When we talk about bringing data in, we're working through things through ETL flows, right? We often don't talk about this necessarily in the context of metadata. We think that metadata is this separate piece that actually, needs to be handled on its own. And that ultimately results in new silos of data for just the metadata about your data. So that's another layer of complexity, independent of systems work, that makes data processing itself a unique task. Data quality is also something that there should be considered metadata. There's a lot of talk about data quality and the freshness of data and where it came from, the pedigree of that data, all impacting how much do I trust it. If you look at a data point devoid of the context of where it came from, it's not necessarily all that telling. You want to be able to trust the veracity of that data, and part of that is through the quality measures that need to be incorporated as part of it. Again, these are all things and flows that tend to be very data-specific tasks, but then start bleeding into the systems component as well, because there's lots of different tools for quality measures. Mastering and deduplication. Inherently, and certainly in Medicaid, we tend to talk about mastering capabilities as almost a separate entity on top of data. We've got our operational data stores, but then we've got our master patient provider indices, and that's the golden record, the truthful record, if you will, that's supposed to somehow clean up all of your data. Now, don't get me wrong, mastering is actually incredibly important, but when it is a separate process from your data, right, both from a systems perspective and from a data perspective, there's complexity that gets introduced in that, right? You need to be able to, first, you need to be able to integrate it early and often, because you want to be able to have that data being updated as you get new data coming in. But at times, if you have separate mastering components from your authoritative data sources, you can get different kinds of latencies that are involved that then can become problematic. Or if a source changes and it's not reflected in the master data, now you've got out of sync master data, and you have to question, well, how frequently does it get updated? These are all data specific challenges that result from the complexity of having different pieces of the system that handle those different pieces of data traditionally. Security is governance. At the end of the day, we have security policies from an application standpoint, but at the end of the day, that ultimately results in a very specific piece of data being able to be accessed or not accessed. You can't have security policies that do not get reflected inside of your data as well. And oftentimes these become fragmented, and as a result, you have a lot of risk that gets introduced into the different data stores that you might be leveraging inside of a MES environment. Lineage is relevant metadata. Now, oftentimes we talk about lineage strictly from a governance perspective, but it's also something that could in fact be queryable, something that you want to be able to run reports on that data to say, I want to know how a data change may impact downstream, consumption of the data. But I also want to know for a specific piece of data, how and when that data changed and by whom, so that you can actually have that auditability of both how and when it changed, and from a security standpoint and lens, that ability to review. This is typically a separate process. And again, it's very data centric, but it's considered to be something that's not really data. I contend, and MarkLogic contends, that lineage is in fact metadata itself that should be queryable and accessible without having to jump through hoops. And lastly, well, I guess this isn't because, but this ultimately results in you want to be able to design mature processes early. And this is the rub. This is the hard part. It's hard because you can start a project with what you know is coming. But as requirements change or new data sources get added or the data inherently changes that you were previously getting, you now need to accommodate those changes. And what you set out to do is different than what you now need to do. And so you have to have a mature data process to be able to accommodate that. Leveraging what we would say are traditional technologies in order to accomplish that is fraught with risk, and for very good reason. Ultimately, data meets systems, right? They're not independent of each other. If you have simpler architectures, you're going to have easier governance, but you can't have simpler architectures when you have to go and stitch together. There it goes. When you have to go and stitch together 10, 11 more different capabilities that are all very data specific in order to accomplish the tasks that you need to do. I mentioned that this is my second time with MarkLogic. My time away from MarkLogic, I was at an upper right-hand quadrant Gartner leading data integration vendor. And in order to do the kinds of tasks that Medicaid projects require, or that we were seeing in other domains as well, we would have to stitch together a multitude of different technologies, all under one corporate umbrella, perhaps, but fundamentally different code bases, different skill sets, different tools, in order to get to an initial operating capability. And this is fraught with risk. It takes a tremendous amount of time. It took us anywhere from 12 to 18 months in order to get to that initial operating capability, to say nothing of actually working on the data itself, because most of these were systems tasks, more so than data tasks, meaning we had to actually, get people with different skill sets and different talents to work all of these different tools. It required a lot of cost up front to be able to, have people with those skill sets and the requisite software technology, to say nothing of perhaps differing infrastructure requirements in order to run those different technologies. You had to have, ultimately a lot of systems work, of systems integration, before you could start working on the data itself, before a business analyst or a data steward could actually start working on that data. And by that time, your requirements have very likely changed, or data sets have grown and things are different. And then suddenly you have to go back and restart it over. Ultimately, these are what I call Franken architectures, right? We sort of stitched all these different things together and it's supposed to work smoothly, but it often doesn't work as promised. So a way to simplify this is through the use of an operational data store. And, frankly, I want to reimagine the operational data store, because I contend that states should demand more from their ODS. There are ways and technologies and capabilities that have since grown that enable you to simplify this without having to do gymnastics on the system side in order to get a clear view of the data. MarkLogic has a data hub for Medicaid that we're going to introduce to you today with our operational data store that contains built-in capabilities that you would previously have to stitch together. This provides a tremendously simpler way to access, load, view, and make use of the data immediately, allowing for our customers, both in Medicaid and in other environments, to be able to see up to a 4x improvement in their time to mission or time to benefit, time to service, versus having done it in a different way. There are other folks who talk about the ODS as, it's just a data store. It's just where the data sits, or maybe they have, a lighter version of an operational data store, because that way they can check the box with it. I would submit that an ODS unto itself, with the ability to actually create that curated data, that harmonized data, that true data that you want without having to stitch together all that you want, can do more than what we're necessarily contending and accepting that it does within, a larger space. So with that, our version of this is the MarkLogic Data Hub for Medicaid. It allows for us to, in one platform, bring in all sorts of kinds of data, from provider, member, claims, mainframe data, put it in as is, meaning we always have the authoritative data available as it comes into MarkLogic. And then we can curate that data into something that perhaps might be more usable for downstream consumption. We can master that data. We have built-in mastering capabilities directly inside of MarkLogic. So there's no latency between your authoritative data being entered and then actually getting access to that true data, because the moment that it gets updated inside of the data hub, our mastering capabilities can pick that up right then and there, which is a tremendous benefit and consolidation. It also makes it so that mastering capabilities don't require a PhD in computational linguistics in order to run the mastering. You don't need folks who are uber specialists in master data management technologies in order to figure out whether or not Gary Katz and G Katz are in fact the same person. And all of this is done in one platform. I want to repeat that. This is done in one platform that is one piece of code, one foundation that allows for us to load this data in and then curate, harmonize, and enhance this data and make it accessible for downstream consumption. This is not 20 different pieces of software that are stuck together. It's one code base that is inextricably tied together. And we think that this is very not only innovative, but we think that this is compelling for being able to actually have data management and visibility into your Mez enterprise. We have enhanced this, as I mentioned, with different accelerator capabilities that are specific to the Medicaid environment. So you'll notice on this chart that we have FHIR interoperability capabilities that are built directly with MarkLogic. We've actually hooked in, and Kevin will be showing this a little later, with a FHIR server that allows for MarkLogic to be able to answer FHIR queries directly out of MarkLogic and return them back in a FHIR compliant way. We've invested in capabilities that allow for you to use MarkLogic out of the box with our healthcare starter kit, so that instead of getting vanilla MarkLogic, you actually have something that's a starter project, if you will, with rules and mappings and security built in, so you can then customize it from there. So most of the startup work is done for you. This is something that we think brings a tremendous amount of innovation into the Medicaid space. And recently, we've updated this with what we call our semantic data catalog. MarkLogic has acquired a capability that allows for us to view some of the metadata that is stored within to be able to correlate data pieces together and help get visibility into the lineage of some of that data as well. So with that, we contend that an operational data store done right can actually provide a simplified platform in one core. Perfectly good as a data lake, by the way, because we have that as is data that comes in. It's always available. So some folks use us for Medicaid data lakes, which we've actually done before. Combined with all of the enterprise capabilities, for security, high availability, disaster recovery, but also the ability to track the metadata, to have visibility into how your data moves throughout that, throughout your ODS. You could start asking questions of it. And lastly, I guess I spent the last part first there, is that we expose that data out in a multitude of ways so that you don't have to ask questions in any one way. MarkLogic is tremendously flexible of addressing query-based searches from a Google-esque perspective, if you will, from search. We can answer very structured queries with SQL. We can touch BI tools. We can, answer graph-based queries. We can use graph-based queries to help discern family relationships that are part of the Medicaid family structures and use that information to glean better insights into, how you assign benefits to a particular member, or whether someone actually, is rightfully claiming that benefit, or if perhaps it's something that needs to be flagged for review. So, with that, this is why we contend that data processing does not need to be a systems integration task, even though it's often done in those modules, if you will. But data processing unto itself can be greatly simplified if you have the right foundation for it. And we're going to show that to you today, and how that works, and how this makes a very significant difference in Medicaid agencies by having capability that allows for us to readily accept new and changing data, consolidating the different systems components that you have in ODS, but you have it with built-in mastering, and it has analytic capabilities that can be used, to answer, reporting or EDW-like questions, or push that data out to a separate EDW, and that's fine. We support interoperability with all of the underlying capability that can be trusted to run a mission-critical operation, such as security, high availability, disaster recovery, and tremendous scale, and with good healthcare and Medicaid quals. So with that, I want to introduce Kevin Morgan, and Kevin will walk us through a demonstration of this capability as well as our semantic data catalog. Kevin?
So kind of what we'll be walking through is how we bring multiple sets of claims into the system. How do we bring beneficiary data, provider data, ingest it into the system, curate it, provide security and governance, and then the ability to expose that data to downstream systems. So the couple examples that we'll use is accessing that data via Power BI, via Tableau, and also via Fire, because part of the value in the ODS is being able to simplify bringing all these different data sources together, whether they're legacy systems that may be retired in a year, but we need the data for now, or new modules that are coming on board. How do we bring all this data together? How do we curate it? How do we master it? And then how do we provide secure access to that data, right? So the couple of the components that we'll show for examples of that are a reporting tool, and then actually using a Fire server to actually query the database as well. So switch over to the demonstration now. So the first component in MarkLogic within the ODS, we typically tend to think about data as entities. And part of the reason we can provide this data agilities is these entities can evolve over time, right? But they give us a starting point of what do we want to target, what do we want to bring in. So in our case, we have members, and those members can have dependents, and those members can have claims, and claims have claim line items. And on those claim items, we have CMS providers who have service locations and hospital affiliations and organizations. But that's the concept, right? Is we bring all these different disparate sources of data together. We curate them into entities that people can then access, make sense of, and get value out of. So to actually go through that process, in our demonstration today, I'll be walking you through the actual user interface. Obviously, in a production system, a lot of these jobs will be done by a job scheduler, but we can load the data. So we have multiple sources of MIMS data. We've got an example of a Curum data, some 837 claims, and then for the provider data, we just took the CMS provider file for 3 states and put it into the database. So we've already gone ahead and done that loading. But you also see as I'm going through this that frequently one of the challenges when people look at solving a data architecture problem is whether it's a data hub, a data lake, an EDW, is how do I engage more people in my organization who truly understand the data, right? Who really understand what it is, how it works with, and there's not a series of hands-off trying to translate that into code that somebody may run in the background, and then 3 years later it ends up in someone's lap to try and maintain. Part of the value within the ODS is a lot of that workload can be done by folks who understand the data who may just have a business analyst background. So for example, if I was to look at my member process and I wanted to figure out how do I map this Curum data that's coming in, how do I need to map this MMIS data, having a tool that allows people to go in and you can drag and drop, you can apply functions, you can do these different components, you can test the data to really understand how I want to bring this data in, how I want to work with it. And it's not just an exercise in writing code, but it's something that a business analyst can come in and add value and work with the ability, because we're MarkLogic and we're a technology company. There's a series of escape hatches. There's the ability to define your own custom functions. There's the ability to write custom functions that overwrite the default behavior. Because especially for our public sector customers, there are going to be unique requirements that maybe you can't do in the UI. So there's the ability to start it in the UI, and then if there's a common function you have that's specific to your organization, that can be registered, and then everyone can use it. But again, trying to drive some of the cost and some of the time out of the process of coming in and doing mapping of data in this process. So that was an example for MIS. This would be a Curum example. So this is an example of a Curum XML file of how we bring that into the system and map it to the entity that we want. Right. So we have our data. We've now gone in and mapped it. Now the next step may be, well, we've got data coming in from multiple legacy systems, from multiple modules. We want to actually go in and actually match and merge, right? We want to actually master. And mastering can be done for any entity. And in our case, I'm showing you an example of doing it with a member, but it's very similar to doing the mapping, right? It's a set of tools where I come in and define rule sets. So I have a set of rules that are looking at my NSN, a set of rules that are looking at my addresses. I define those rules, and then I configure thresholds, right? And the thresholds are going to tell me, which ones do I want to automatically merge and which ones do I want to be able to notify somebody. And those are things that you can set. So in the MMIS world, we've seen folks have, that they want to match 80 to 90% automatically and reduce the amount of burden that people are doing from a notification perspective. But we have other customers in public sector, for example, in the DoD and Intel agencies, who are almost flipped, right? They want, unless they're absolutely 100% sure, they want a human review. And so there's a flexibility based on what you're mastering, what type of entity you're mastering, to set different thresholds and different rules, giving you the control of how to come in and do that, right? And then you can come in and plot it. You can do things like actually test the data. So if I provide one of the URIs and I wanted to come in and test my rules, I'm just going to cut and paste a URI in, and then click the test button. And I can see, based on the rules that I currently have set up, that it's telling me that there's going to be 4 things that potentially match. And here's the reason why they match. It matches on the exact, nothing on this double metaphone or zip code, right? And I can come in and take a look at that so that I can evolve my rules and work with my rules to get the best fit for my agency. And then in MarkLogic speak, from a mastering perspective, we break that up into 2 steps. The second step is really controlling rules of how do I want to merge the data. So in our case, our strategy is we're taking the last updated value. For a lot of customers, there may be certain systems that are designated as the golden record, and you would want to take the value from those systems for those particular data elements. You can come in here, and a business analyst can come in here and add those rules into the system. And it defines which data do you want to keep. Do you want to keep all the values? Do you want to keep some of the values? Do you want to keep one data as primary? But the ability to come in and for customers to come in and work and define those rules. So once we've brought the data into the system, we've done some of that initial validation. Let's say I want to go look at some of the data in my system. So I can come in and do a search for a person named Drindy. And I can see, okay, here's my Drindy record. And just because I've worked with this data, I know this is something that's actually been mastered. In this mastering rule for full name, we're keeping all the values. So we've taken 3 different sources of data, brought it into a single entity. I can see that Drindy has a dependent that's Nuno Day and Nuno Day Jr., which I'll come back to in a minute. And Drindy also has some claims. And those claims have claim line items, right? And those claim line items have providers who have service locations, who have specialties, right? And who may actually have other claims that may be associated to. So the ability to quickly without having to restate the data to link these different sources of data in together and quickly navigate search and start to understand the data and link the data, right? So one of the big things about the ODS is the ability and the flexibility to rapidly bring that data in and link it together so you can start to understand and work with the data. So I told you I would come back to the dependent. So if I look at Nuno, for example, I can see that we went ahead and merged Nuno Day and Nuno Day Junior. In our particular case, that doesn't sound right to me. So our rule probably wasn't everywhere it needed to be. And if I want to at this point in time, I can actually come in and unmerge those records, right? And now we see Nuno Day and Nuno Day Junior. Because from a MarkLogic perspective, I don't know the exact technical term in the mastering world, but when we're bringing and mastering that data, it's not a destructive merge, right? Because the fact that we're keeping the pointers and we're keeping some of this data, I can roll back those changes, in this case with clicking a button, or it could be as simple as an API call, because that's real life, right? You're constantly getting new data in that may inform decisions, and you may need to adjust mappings, you need to adjust mastering. So the ability to meet customers where they are in terms of that's real life, that's what people work with. Also on the mastering front, I mentioned we had those different thresholds, some that were automatically merged and some that provided notifications. Here's an example of a notification where it's going to list here's potential records that may be a match. They didn't meet our threshold to automatically merge it. And we can come in and say, do we want to block this merge or do we want to automatically merge this record? Also, if I look at the Drindy record, we talk about the pedigree and provenance of the data. Understanding as the system is going through it, we're going to be tracking, right, that full pedigree and provenance of the data. So what brought it into the system? What updated? What was it derived from? What rule sets did we apply? Because understanding the data's journey is critical to understanding the data and working with the data, right? So understanding why decisions were made and being able to track back and understand that, and why changes were made, why things were done to the system can be critically important, right? So having that provenance of the data as we work through it is an important part of the life cycle. Another important part of the life cycle, so I've been logged in as Dr. Smith. If I log in now as Mr. No PII and come into the system, and you can probably guess based on my wonderfully unique naming of my users, what I might be trying to show you here. So we have two different users, and this particular user, Mr. No PII, sees a redacted version of the data based on the rules that he has set up. So I can see that the full name has actually been obfuscated, and that can be with leading zeros, that can be whatever else. I've got other data that's fully redacted from the system. And there's the flexibility in these redaction rules. So they can be deterministic, right? So if we're doing redaction and we're looking at claims, we don't want to have claim dates, for example, that don't make sense, right? Claim dates that were before somebody were born, right? Or they can be custom, they can be rule-based. You know, if you want to take an age and have the age just be minor, adult, or senior, you can do those types of components. And then those rules are at the data level, right? So when APIs are called, when things are pulling data from the system, they're automatically applied to the data, right? It's not something that has to be done in the middle layer or that you're relying on the EDW to do or any of those different components, right? Those rules are automatically applied because we're fully governing the data, both from a who can see what, but also what data gets redacted as we try to push it outside the system. Okay, so we've showed you different data sources coming in, walking through how we go through some of the curation process, a quick example of two different users who are coming in and looking at different privileges of the data, that full pedigree and provenance of the data. The next step in the process typically for folks is I have external systems that are going to need access to the data. So one example might be is I need to, because of interoperability requirements, expose this data and do API calls to FHIR systems, to interoperability systems. So as Gary mentioned, as part of our accelerator program, we actually created for a number of the different resources the ability to have a FHIR compliant system, send a FHIR query to MarkLogic, and for us to respond back to that API with FHIR compliant responses. So in this case, the example I'm going to use is I've got one of our interoperability systems, and it's going to pass me a query for a specific user in the FHIR format. So this is the API call that's being done, and then it's hitting the data service that's on the ODS, and it's actually responding back with the FHIR compliant API data service response, right? Here's our Drendy Day user, right? So it's an example of, okay, we've done a wonderful job and a quick job of bringing all this data together into the ODS. How do we start to then expose that data? So one quick example of being able to do that via FHIR, via data service example. Another common example we might see is, we want to be able to access that data through a BI tool. And one of the behind the scenes, one of the things that I think is really cool is when we define those entities in the systems, those entities also create SQL views of the data. So I don't have to have a BI system that understands how to do link calls or do those types of things. It can talk to those systems in the language that they understand. So up top, you can see here in Tableau, and this is just using the MarkLogic name connector from Tableau that's available on the Tableau marketplace. Similar components are available for Qlik, for Power BI, and a number of the tools out there in the market space. So I have my claim, on my items, I have my providers, and I have my service locations. And here's that same data, but it's now just represented in a tabular format, right? So here's my client claimable items in tabular format. Here's my providers in that tabular format and my service locations. And then I can start to actually use Tableau to create reports and to do some interesting things. So one of the things that you can do is you can actually look at member counts, right? So frequently when people are going through a mastering process, they want to understand how are things evolving? What do things look like before I mastered and after I mastered, right? So are we really being effective? What quality was our data? What are our claim counts by zip code? Since MarkLogic has the ability to also have geospatial indexes, we can also expose that data geospatially. In this case, we're using Tableau to do that. But at the federal level, we frequently use the Esri connector, and folks are accessing data in MarkLogic via Esri if geospatial is a critical component to you. So part of, again, that value is not just the ability to quickly bring all that data together in the ODS and then secure it and govern it, but provide access, whether it's a data service through FHIR or access via Tableau to come in and do BI, some of those components. So that was the first component that we wanted to walk through, is really what does an ODS mean in MarkLogic speak, right? What does that mean? What does that impact? How do you really work with the data, bring it in, curate it, master it, secure it, and then provide access to the systems? One of the next items and one of the newer components that we wanted to start talking about is really what we've started to see as an evolving need in the market of, as people are looking at data from the enterprise level. The ODS does a really great job of starting to democratize the ability for people to work with that data and provide input and provide feedback and to do mappings and to do those components. But more broadly, there's also a need for a greater understanding of the data, right? So really to have a full enterprise understanding and view of that data in terms of what's the life cycle as it works through our system. So how do I understand what knowledge might be in a legacy system that's feeding us data? What's the structure in there? What's the reference data? What's the other components? Within the ODS, how am I mapping it? How am I working with that? And then how is it used in downstream systems, right? And how do our internal policies and procedures apply? Really what we're trying to do with this semantic data catalog is it allow you to link those different ways of thinking and working with that data, and provide that data, metadata as a core capability within the ODS, so you can really get an understanding of the data, right? So, a simplified example might be, let's say there's, something changing with the NPI, right? How do I understand as the data flows through the system where we're working with that data, right? What are my legacy systems feeding to me? How am I mapping those components within my ODS? What downstream systems and reports are using with that data? And how does that tie into my policy? Really what we're trying to do is, if you think about these individual components, there's domain knowledge, whether it's in the reporting, whether it's in the legacy system, whether it's the people in the middle that are doing your ODS. How do we capture the domain knowledge from all those different components and link it together so that we really have a complete understanding of the data, right? That's what we're trying to accomplish with the semantic data catalog, is how do we take that knowledge, that reference, that understanding, how do we capture that as metadata and link it together so we really understand the impact of a change, right? Goes beyond just documenting. That's the first and easiest use case to think about. And as someone who for 20 years did enterprise level implementations, trying to find that documentation for what a source system said and what a field rep meant here and what it meant as we move through from the organization is generally the first thing that people latch onto because it's easy to understand. But it can be much more broader than that in terms of really getting a true enterprise understanding of your data. So that's what the data catalog that works with the ODS is meant to provide. So it's that business glossary, the source system structure, the quality data, the process data from within the ODS, the curated data within the ODS, and then also how we're using it downstream. So bring all those components together so that we can get a complete understanding of the life cycle of the data within our system and have that true ability to effectively work with our data. So let me go show you a quick simplified example of that. So if I go to my semantic data catalog, you'll see I have a number of different components, right? So I have a set of business glossaries, where I have claim terms, organization terms, person terms. I have a set of regulatory and policy compliance components. And then I have my structure, right? You may think of this as kind of like your conceptual, your logical, and your physical model. And that's one way that you can represent this. It can be represented also much more broadly. So from a structure perspective, I have my CSV file, right? And that CSV file is actually the source system structure, right? So the data that's being fed in, how does that legacy system represent the data, right? How does it represent a payer, right? And what do those particular data elements about the payer really mean, right? And do we have alternative labels? Are there preferred labels? Are there ways to map this data, right? And then I have an output structure, for example, which might be, here's my patient from a fire perspective, right? So here's my patient. Patient has a name and identifier. It's linked to fire, right? Fire is linked to the structure. And then I have the entities within the ODS, right? And all these components here in the structure perspective are being fed and populated by the ODS. So we can come in and do that. So if I go back to the example I mentioned earlier, and say there's a change going on, it may be in this case to the NPI. So if I search on NPI and then look at my visualizer, I can see the different components of how that's used within our system. So I can see it's regulated by a specific policy, that we have different fields that may feed us that data, and that it's part of a particular, in this case, is part of the provider component in an actual structure, right? And it's representing this. So rather than having to manually go through the system and understand how all these things are linked together, I can come right in and see that component, right? So if I needed to understand there's a change going on, how do I work with that? I can do that, right? I can also see more broadly that the NPI rule is also part of HIPAA, for example, right? And that, in addition to that, there's also security rules. And when I look at my security rules, I can document the fact. I can document the facts of what it actually regulates. What are the related concepts? What are the metadata? I can capture things about the CSV file. I can capture things about the policy. And these can be living, breathing components that allow me to work with the data, right? Another example that you may commonly see are claim codes, right? Or ICD-9, ICD-10 codes, the ability to load those up and express the linkages here within the system. And in our case, we're feeding data up to the catalog to explore, but the catalog can also push the data back down. So if I wanted to enrich the data, we could actually call that within the ODS to understand, well, here's alternative identifiers, and I can feed that to an EDW. I can feed that to a downstream system. But it's really about how do I start to get a true understanding at the enterprise level of the data that I'm working with, right? So starting with the ODS and the ability to quickly work with lots of different types of data, to be able to master it, to be able to curate it, to be able to provide secure access to that data through data services and other open standards APIs. And then stepping up even more at the enterprise knowledge level of how do I put a semantic data catalog in place that really allows me to get a deeper understanding. So much how I started to engage business analysts within the ODS and within those components to define rules and to define those components, I can also have those same analysts and those same domain experts coming into my data catalog to further enrich that process.
Yeah, in the interest, we can move right back to Q&A. I did notice in the chat from the questions that are coming in that it looks like there had been some audio-visual feeds. So audio-visual challenges rather. So, if you are logged in and you're having an AV issue, I want to make clear, everyone, that we're going to make sure that you can get an archive version of this so that you can see it if you weren't able to see the screen at some point. So don't worry about that. There was a question that I think is good, Kevin, that came in here for you to address. Good for you to address. It asks, what scope differences would you suggest for ODS versus EDW?
I guess maybe a difference in scope, not really scope, but maybe in terms of approach. I think from an ODS perspective, while you want to start and put policies and architectures in place, I think from an ODS perspective, you can chunk the data in smaller components and evolve it more rapidly and take a true, more agile approach to the data. Most commonly, we see people take, module at a time in terms of pulling data into the ODS. So they may do a pilot to prove out the architecture and get an understanding and put security and governance things in place. But really kind of biting it off in digestible chunks whether that maps to a module, whether that maps to a region within your particular state. It really kind of is determined in part based on the overall implementation approach that folks are taking. But taking that first step of really, we want to put the architecture and the ability to do the governance in place first, and then start chunking and working with the data as it makes sense in your implementation.
Yeah. Another question has come in. Are you beginning to talk with state agencies about interoperability and fire compliance? The answer to that is yes, we most certainly are. Part of the value and sort of, kind of coming back to where I positioned this in the first place of expecting more out of your ODS and why an ODS is important is that you should be able to answer these kinds of questions directly out of your ODS because that's where your data lives. So the fact that we have the fire capabilities inside of our data hub for Medicaid is tremendous value to state agencies. And so we are talking with them about this for compliance with the CMS interoperability rule and how we can make that easier. So yes, 100%, absolutely. And I should note, by the way, the Medicaid accelerators that we put out, these are of no charge. These are things we put out into the community, meaning they're as Kevin mentioned, for instance, with fire, we started with 4 domains that we put out there and we've released it as open source. So folks can go in and see how we've constructed the 4 different resources and then add to it, extend it as needed. But this is something that we just do as part of our investment in the Medicaid community. Okay, looking at other questions. What if I have an existing mastering tool already? Do I need to use MarkLogic's mastering? How do you work with separate MPIs? Kevin?
So from MarkLogic perspective, there's the flexibility. We believe we provide a higher degree of flexibility. But if at an enterprise level you've made an investment in another MPI solution, that can just be a flow that you don't run within the ODS, right? That you take the NPI number in as a hardcore defined field, and you bring that in, and then we communicate back and forth via the open APIs to that system. And you could do that, or I've also seen states where they've come in, they've said they've had an NPI solution, but then maybe they wanted to bring in broader sets of data from human services, and those components weren't part of what they were flowing through within their division. So they used it as a filter for new data sets that maybe weren't part of the core Medicaid process, but that they wanted to link in to provide additional value. So I've seen folks do that as well, that they take what's coming from the MPI as gospel truth for what the MPI is working with, but they may still run MarkLogic for new data sets that are coming in that may not be part of the scope of the MPI yet. So I've seen it work all ends of the spectrum, to be honest. But from MarkLogic's perspective, it's a capability that's there. It's an implementation decision whether you choose to use it partially, or use it not at all. We would like you to use it, obviously, but it's the real world, right? So we have to be able to support all the different use cases.
Okay. We've got time for a couple more questions, and whatever questions we don't get to, we'll certainly follow up in email. Are the different capabilities sold separately? The answer is all, but the MarkLogic Data Hub for Medicaid is all one capability. There are some options there, generally speaking, but relatively few. Most of our customers, for instance, leverage only a couple of the options that we typically have seen for advanced security and for the graph semantic capabilities, but otherwise it's all one offering. However, the semantic data catalog is new into MarkLogic via a recent acquisition, And there is work being done on convergence there at the moment. We obtained a company called SmartLogic and their semaphore offering. We've done work with them many times in the past. We've actually had a close relationship with the company, and that's part of the reason for the acquisition, because of how they enhance what we already do. So right now, the data catalog is separate, but we are working to bring those together from our core product offering standpoints. Okay, another question. Can a semantic data catalog capture my lineage data as well? Kevin?
Yes, you can feed the lineage data up to the semantic data catalog, or it can be captured within the ODS as well. So it can go both directions in terms of being able to capture that.
Okay, Kevin, there's I guess we got time for one more. From an organizational development perspective, how does an ODS impact a larger modularity implementation?
I believe that it gives you more flexibility and agility from a modularity perspective, because of the ability to be more flexible in terms of how those modules roll in and roll out. I think with the modern ODS that MarkLogic provides, it allows you to react to a broader spectrum of requirements, whether they're legacy modules or whether they're modules that are using the latest and greatest from an industry standard perspective. So I think it enhances that modularity and puts a layer of kind of management and of abstraction from a data perspective that allows you to have additional flexibility in terms of moving things around from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'll chime in on that one as well. And Kevin, can you move to the last slide as well, because we're right at time. So while I'm talking, we can have that slide up. But fundamentally, having an ODS manage your data processes, right, and actually having it simplify those data processes makes modularity easier, because your data, your modules now have one place to be able to go to get that curated, cleaned data. They don't have to go. It makes it simpler for that underlying foundation to make that data available to those modules and how that data might be shared if there's data sharing through, whatever the mechanism is, whether it's direct or whether it's through ESB or whatnot. It ultimately makes it so that there's a single source of, hey, I know that I've got my curated, high quality, high fidelity, operational, cleansed data in a particular spot, so that you should hopefully, the idea is be able to have that leverage within those modules much more quickly than you otherwise would if you had to wait on that data to be available because of protracted long systems integration processes that would have historically been done if you don't use an ODS. If you use an ODS, you don't need to worry about that. You actually focus more on the data, which should ultimately make that more shareable to the downstream modules that might leverage it. We are at time, so I do want to thank everyone for your time today in joining us and being with us with the Health IT folks, and thank the Health IT folks again for giving us the opportunity to speak today. We are going to be at MESC in Charlotte, so we are invited to come visit us at our booth. We also have a conference room where we are happy to give custom demonstrations, presentations, Q&A with our expert team to be able to address any of your concerns and actually work shoulder to shoulder. What kind of data are you looking at? How do you think that could work? What do you think we could do with the data? And we'll give you our best read on and our best insights of how we can help, and hopefully have a productive conversation to that end. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And certainly on Wednesday evening from 5:30 to 7:30, we are having a happy hour, cocktails, dinner, and drinks at a rooftop bar called Fahrenheit with celebrity chef Rocco Whalen. And that's going to be certainly a good time. So So please mark your calendars, come out and join us and relax a bit after a long day at the conference, and we look forward to seeing you there. Rob, back to you. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Kevin. We really appreciate your support for continuing to educate our members around some of these data modernization initiatives. And this was a great version, was a great version of how these sorts of opportunities can be leveraged. Yes, certainly do join with the MarkLogic team at MESC. I will be at MESC as well. So opportunities connect with me. And we'll also be educating all of our members later on this year around these sorts of opportunities should other vendors want to contribute to the state community education efforts as well. So certainly more information to come on that. But other than that, we do want to thank again the MarkLogic team for providing this educational opportunity. And we'll be sending out the archive materials. We did have one or two messages coming in regarding those technical issues. So we will make sure the archive is posted within 24 hours, and we'll get that out to you via an email. All registrants for today's session will receive an email with those details. Thanks again, and congratulations to the team. Great job. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.